All right, hello once again. Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD or Application and Website Development Program, and in particular the AWD 1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class, I have been going over the textbook that will be used for this class for the fall 2019 semester, creating video presentations based on this book, Pro ASP.NET MVC 5. An A-Press text by Adam Freeman. I am coming toward the end of Chapter 19 of 27, creating the example. To begin the exploration of asynchronous controllers, I'm going to show you an example of the kind of problem they are intended to solve. Figure 1925 shows a regular synchronous controller called remote data that's been added to the sample project. So this is our remote data controller. Don't know if I copied that or not, so I'm going to, nothing else, I'll recopy it. Now the author mentions here on page 555, the controller contains an action method data which creates an instance of the model remote service and calls the get remote data product on it. This method is an example of a time-consuming, low CPU activity. All right, so in the models folder, we have to add this remote service.cs class. I do not believe it's in there. And the author says, okay, I admit I faked the get remote data method. In the real world, the method would be retrieving complex data across the slow network connection. But to keep things simple, the author used the thread.sleep method to simulate a 2-second delay. The last addition needed is a new view created in the view's remote data folder. And called data.cshtml. We are going to remove the code from there and add the code that is shown on the bottom portion of page 555. When you run the application and navigate to the remote data URLs, let's do that. The action method is invoked. The remote service object is created and the get remote data method is called. After 2 seconds simulating a real operation, the data is returned from the get remote data method passed to the view as rendered in figure 1911 on page 556. The problem here is that the worker thread that was handling the request was idle for 2 seconds. It wasn't doing anything useful, and it was not available for handling other responses while waiting. The author gives you a cautionary note, though, on this, near the top of page 556, saying using an asynchronous controller frees up a worker thread so that it can process other queries. It doesn't prevent a user from experiencing a 2-second wait. All right, so let's create the asynchronous controller, and that'll finish up the chapter. So I am on page 556, halfway down. Having shown you the problem I was going to solve, I can now move on to create the asynchronous controller. There's 2 ways of doing this. One is to implement system.web.mvc.async.iasync async controller interface, which is the asynchronous equivalent of iController. I'm not going to demonstrate that approach because it requires so much explanation of the .NET concurrent program facilities. I want to stay focused on the MVC program, on the MVC framework, which is why the author says you will demonstrate the second approach, to use the new await and async keywords in a regular controller. In previous versions of .NET Framework, creating asynchronous controllers was complex and required a lot of work. The new await and async keywords, which were described the first time in Chapter 4, have simplified the process quite a bit. So we're going back to the remote data controller file that's here. I'm going to just remove everything that's in here and replace it with the code that's shown on page 557. Not a bad time, I'm sure, to come in and do a file save all. We have refactored the action method so that it returns a task action result, applied the async and wait keywords, and created a task list of strings, which is responsible for calling the getRemoteData method. You can also use an asynchronous controller to consume asynchronous methods elsewhere in the app. To demonstrate this, we've added an asynchronous method to the remote service class. So again, I'm just going to copy all of it. The result from this getRemoteDataAsync method is a list of tasks which yields the same message as the synchronous method when it's completed. In listing 1930, you can see how we've consumed this in a new action method that was added to the remote data controller. So let's go to the remote data controller. Let's go down to the bottom. Let's add what is shown here. And the author says, you can see that both action methods now follow the same basic pattern. The difference is where the task object is created. The result of calling either action method is that the worker thread is not tied up while waiting for the getRemoteData call to complete. In other words, that thread is available to process other requests, which can significantly improve the performance of the MVC framework application. So, to summarize this chapter, we saw how the MVC framework creates controllers and invokes methods. The underlying theme of the chapter is extensibility. Almost every aspect of the MVC framework can be modified or replaced entirely. In the next chapter, which is Chapter 20, all right, so in Chapter 20, we will turn to views. The author will explain how views work and how to configure and customize the default behaviors. So we'll pick that one up tomorrow.